When I was a kid traveling abroad, travel was stressful. I had an Ethiopian passport, and at the time it was a red communist government, and I would go to the customs officer and I always dreaded it. Same when the passport turned a blue color and it was still an Ethiopian passport. I quickly understood that coming from that part of the world and going to places like the United States meant that I would always be scrutinized because of my passport. And so one of my earliest wishes when I was younger was to have a passport that would allow me to just whiz through, that no one would question, that no one would think that I was suspicious. And that's when I understood the term passport privilege. And that's what I want to talk about today. I think that it's a topic that is becoming more and more relevant. It's not new, but it is definitely growing today with everything that's happening, including new restrictions. So, Sunday is World Tourism Day. It's a day that the UN celebrates, and I'm sure they're going to talk about sustainability. In fact, I think the theme is sustainable transformation. If you really think about it, travel has always been about those who have and those who don't. I just thought back this week to all of the trouble that I had to go through in my lifetime to get a US passport, to become a US citizen, and to enjoy the privilege of having a US passport and being able to freely move around the world, many parts of the world, including being able to easily move abroad when I needed to as a travel journalist, etc. I mean, I'm not going to lie, when I got my US passport, I was thrilled. And I think that for those who've never had the difficulty of getting a visa, lining up at the embassy, hoping that the interview goes well, hoping that your fees that you paid that are quite hefty will not be wasted if you're denied, that you won't be looked at or scrutinized as a criminal or feel less than, that when you're in line at the customs, they won't give you any trouble. All of those things are legitimate worries for those who have passports that require additional scrutiny because of, I don't know, the governments or diplomacy, and who gets to decide these things, who has privilege and who doesn't. But it determines who gets to travel. It determines who gets to live abroad and have the kind of life that they want to have. For example, let's look at the United States. As of October 1, the visa fees for folks looking to visit the United States, most folks, except for those part of the visa waiver program, most countries and their applicants will have to pay a $250 fee, an extra fee on top of the regular visa fee, whether it's tourist or other. It's getting a lot more expensive to visit the United States starting in October under this current administration. And they say that it's really to deter people who overstay their visas. At the same time, there is this big wave, right, of Americans moving abroad and leaving the United States. I actually wrote about the story in Bloomberg Business Week. It's actually something that's been happening for the last 10 years that I've seen myself as a traveler, not just moving, but just seeing more Black travelers, more travelers of color going abroad and becoming digital nomads, or like staying long term and just moving around the world and discovering other cultures and other places, which is a great thing. But we also have to recognize that they wouldn't be able to do that if they didn't have a US passport. In other words, not just US, but some other privileged kind of passport that lets them move around the world more freely, and get the paperwork more easily. It's a great thing. I love seeing that. I think that if we engage with other people more and we stayed away from our screens, we would realize that actually the world is a much better place than we think it is. Yes, there are a lot of really messed up things happening, but at the same time, having that passport allows us to connect with other people. But somehow travel has just not become about that anymore. If you really look at social media, if you look at what's happening with the protests and over tourism, and then there's also a wave of anti-immigrant protests, like the huge one that happened in the United Kingdom. And all of these things really make you think about movement today and what it means, what people are restricted from moving, those who are not. It's really ironic that the very passport that lets you move abroad and lets you settle easily to places is the one that Americans are using to also leave their country. Then you have places like Barbados. It was just announced last week. Barbados, St. Vincent, and Belize have agreed to let their citizens freely move in and out of their countries. In other words, they can live there, they can move there, they can work there. They're free to do so without any other requirement, which is pretty incredible. And then you have countries like Chad that are reciprocating the travel ban from the United States and banning visas. And you have countries like Kenya and Burkina Faso who are opening up their borders to African citizens and saying, you don't need a visa to come here. Or if you do need a visa, you don't have to pay. So everything is shifting. Movement is shifting. But at the core of it, it's still the few privileged countries that have the ability to go places without a visa, that have the ability to stay a certain number of months without a visa. And that hasn't fundamentally changed. And so I think that the conversation that we need to be having, if it were my choice on World Tourism Day, would be what can we do to tap into our passport privilege so that it benefits others? What can we do to talk about visiting places or moving abroad, but doing so not just for our own benefit, but also for the benefit of those who don't have those rights, those who have been excluded? Because it's really not just about your easy life. I know that that's the current theme, and I get it. I get the pressure that you have when you live in the United States and you're constantly on this kind of hamster wheel. Life is expensive. And, the current administration's numerous changes. And I mean, some of us are even afraid to travel. We haven't done anything illegal. We are either, permanent residents or naturalized citizens, but we're still afraid to travel because we've seen this indiscriminate picking on people at the border. Why aren't we talking about that? Because that's also part of equity. Should we really be afraid when we are legal, when we have done the right things to travel? There's all of these different topics that no one is really addressing in the travel industry. No one is talking about the privilege of your passport to allow you to move abroad and the importance of recognizing that. And I think that is still an important conversation to have. I just want to hear what you guys think about the increased visas to the United States, or do you think that that will backfire on Americans abroad and make it less safe for them, or will they be more subject to scrutiny, or will some countries retaliate with visa fees? I know that Brazil recently reinstated their visa fee for Americans, but so far, very few have. Well, let's see. We don't know what will happen, but that's where we are right now. I want to ask you if you've thought about your passport privilege, and when you move abroad, how will you put that to good use, not just for yourself, but for the people in the destinations that you visit? Leave me a note in the comments, and I'll see you on the next Tuesday Tourism Lens Talk.